So I'm thinking about art and anti-art and something like doodling, and it's inspired by two things actually. It's firstly inspired by a video series that DosSpook is making, where he's talking and engaging in Google Hangouts whilst constructing one of his large paintings. So it's partly inspired by that, and also by a conversation that I've had and I'm kind of still having in the philosophy of mind community with a chap who's an artist who's being quite critical about the history of what he refers to as anti-art, and Duchamp in particular. He's comparing Duchamp and Picasso, at least that's how he started off, and he's kind of upholding an understanding of art as being associated with a certain kind of technique, a certain kind of genius perhaps, and the work of people like Duchamp and a number of artists who follow in that tradition, he says, are meaningless drivel. And I can understand where he's coming from, kind of. I don't agree with it, but I can understand what he's saying. So I'm thinking about these two things, and firstly I'm thinking, you know, what is the function of these kind of outpourings, these kind of visual representations for me? And I'm just stressing for me, what is the purpose of these images that we put on walls and in galleries? And secondary to that, what might be the function of a kind of anti-art response, a kind of anarchic trolling of art in a way that Duchamp and some others may have been involved in, an undermining of the credibility of those processes, if I want to think of it in those terms. Okay, the first thing is about visual art practice and other kinds of art practice as well, but visual art particularly, I suppose. And you know, there's millions of different ways of looking at that, and there's lots of different theories about it, and I'm not going to engage with all those. But one of the things that I find interesting is in relation to epistemic actions. I'll explain what I mean exactly by that term in a second. But the production of visual images as a kind of outsourcing of cognitive activity. Images, you know, whether they be carved in a cave wall hundreds of thousands of years ago, or whether they be rendered on computer screens and pieces of paper now, as kind of means of thinking outside the confines of your own head. And I know that sounds a bit woo, perhaps, but there's some good evidence that that's one of the things we do. The term epistemic action that I used a minute ago comes from a couple of theorists called Maglio and Kirsch, and they were looking at people who play chess, and they were looking at people who play what's it called? That game called where the blocks fall from the top. It'll come back to me in a minute. Which sounds like a long way from art, but stay with me for a second. And they're looking at how people play these games, and something like chess, if you're a novice player particularly, whilst you're playing the game, typically what you'll do is you'll pick a piece up and you'll try it in different places, and then look at the board with it, you know, kind of temporarily placed in these different places. And Maglio and Kirsch are asking, you know, why do people do that? Why don't they just look at the board and work it out rationally, what the best move is? But apparently people do actually perform better if you allow them to do this. They're aiding their imaginative abilities by outsourcing some of that imagination onto the environment. And the same with this game the computer game where the blocks fall from the top, which I still can't remember, it's so irritating. You know, if you allow people to move the blocks as they're coming down, as people do, then they're better at it. So what they refer to these as epistemic actions, things which are part of a kind of knowledge gathering process. But it doesn't just take place in here where you just think it. You actually get involved in the world, you know, and you manipulate the world around you to help you think. And they extend that analysis to things like the abacus, you know, which outsources some of our ability to count onto the outside environment, or even to things like post-it notes, you know, you're on the phone to someone, they tell you a number, rather than commit it to memory, you just do it here, you know, so memory is outsourced onto the page. So that's the idea of epistemic actions. And I quite like that as an idea. And I think, for me at least some part of visual art practice, probably not all, but some part of it, is something like that. A way of trying to understand, represent, make coherent, possibly theorize something about the outside environment by rendering it, rendering it onto a two-dimensional surface, thinking outside of your head. You know, and we see kids do this, you know, when you're a kid you draw pictures, when you're in school you doodle in the margins, you know. And as I say, it seems to have gone back to the dawn of human consciousness, doesn't it? As I say, the carvings and the paintings on cave walls in France or whatever. So it does seem to be a crucial part of evolutionary development, the fact that at some point we decided to do that kind of thing, outsource consciousness, cognitive processes at least, onto the outside environment. And if you're anything like me, you'll probably do it all the time. You know, you're probably sketching. You know, if you've got an idea that you're trying to realise, not just sometimes it's about drawing a picture of it, isn't it? Drawing a picture of the idea because it's something like that. But sometimes it's more like a diagram, and sometimes it's a combination somewhere between a diagram and a picture. Sometimes it's none of these things. Sometimes it's just a way of organising the information in complex ways, joining things up. Maybe doing spider diagrams, mind maps, and flow diagrams. You know, these are all kind of visual ways of thinking, aren't they? Visual thinking outside of your head. And I think the same goes for a lot of the activity that goes on within visual practice generally. You know, by producing things like symbols, whether that be the symbols that we call numbers, and or the symbols that we call archetypes, or the symbols that, you know, populate the world of kind of Jungian psychoanalysis. You know, these are all representations of these things, are all ways of externalizing that thought process to help it operate better, almost as if we're creating a second chamber to our consciousness. The world is the second chamber that we operate within in order to be able to think better. So that's part of that. But the interesting thing about that is, of course, that this world here that we're outsourcing our consciousness onto is a shared environment, isn't it? It's an interpersonal space. Even if I just write a telephone number on this piece of paper and leave it lying about somewhere where you go, you'll see this telephone number. So in some way, to the extent that that number represents the outsourcing of my thoughts, you have direct access to my thoughts. So that thought becomes shared in a literal way, not in any kind of weird metaphysical, mystical way. It's just there it is, right? And the same with our images. If I'm outsourcing the contents of my consciousness into the world, and you have access to those images, then you have access to some part of my outsourced consciousness, and I in turn have access to yours. And this is just what language does, right? I mean, you're doing this just with language, because the words that are coming out of my mouth now are kind of an outsourcing of the things that are going inside my head. So we do this already, but we're very familiar with it with spoken language. But I think images are doing kind of the same thing, aren't they? And that realm of activity we call art is one of the places where that happens, I think. And it becomes interesting at that point, because kind of conversations build up. And if you're familiar with arts practice, you'll know that a lot of art histories represent kind of long public conversations that are taking place in the public realm between different people's outsourced consciousnesses, different people's images, symbols, metaphors, diagrams, structures of thought are being responded to, almost in the way that videos are responded to. You know, you can kind of see that, particularly in fast-moving times like 20th century. You can kind of see how there's patterns of conversation move through these things, which are fascinating to observe, really. And that's a good thing. You know, in an ideal world, you know, several things should happen, but one of the things that could happen, for example, is we become much more literate in those kind of areas, and much more legible, and much more comfortable and confident with the idea that we could converse in images. And it isn't about making sure that your image is great and that it has to be an accurate representation of the thing you're looking at. It just has to be an outsourcing, right? Because this is where the play happens here. In an ideal world, we'd all feel more comfortable with that, and we might even have something like institutions, which, or cultural centres of some kind, where we somehow, by some kind of democratic process or some process of selection, allow the really interesting conversations to come to the fore. So we can go along there and see the conversation that's taking place take place, to see the outpourings of the most interesting aspects of the consciousness that we share outsourced onto the walls of this environment. And we might call those galleries, and we might call the things on the wall art. And if that's all that was going on, that would be an interesting process. But that's not what's going on, is it? Because in addition to those processes, we also have other kinds of processes. We have processes of individuals who are egomaniacs, who will do anything to gain fame. We have processes in which there is a desire to create and manipulate celebrities. We have a society in which there is a massive stratification of economic access, which gives the desire to promote certain things in value so that we get promoted in price. It's a society and an environment in which we want to perhaps gain in self-esteem and reflect our status by being selective and creating objects of special taste. So all these, what I think of are kind of social, economic, political, ideological forces, interpersonal forces. No, I don't think it's evil capitalists, but it could be. All these other forces are at work, which in many ways kind of prevent the what could be a kind of interesting set of public conversations in which my outsourced consciousness talks to your outsourced consciousness somehow, just by exchanging images. There's more to say about that, but I'll make a separate video on that. So those kind of forces, those social forces, and the elitisms and the economic advantages and so on, and the egotisms which shoot through that stuff, all that kind of make it difficult to participate in the public conversation of art. We feel excluded from it, it's perverted by those forces, and so on. That being the case, it's quite useful sometimes when you get trolls coming along, like Duchamp, and many in his wake since, who do things deliberately to undercut not the prospect of art itself, not the idea that art could be beautiful, or not the idea that art could be representational, not the idea that art could be could have fantastic techniques applied to it, none of those things, but undercuts the idea that this is an elite activity, that this is something that not everybody could participate in, that this is something which is intimately connected to wealth and power, that this is something which most of us can't do, and only some of us can, and if you can't do it at all, then you're just a consumer. Just a consumer. You know, you're either a producer or a consumer, but you can't, that's that. You know, anything that undercuts all those kind of strategies seems to me like a good thing. And I think that's what Duchamp is on about. Just other things happen as a result. Other interesting things happen as a result. Other kinds of philosophies kick in. But the idea of saying, yeah, that's very nice, thank you for putting all these beautiful pictures in this really expensive palace, and preventing the rest of us from seeing it, that's great. But shouldn't art be about, at least partly, a public conversation? A public conversation which doesn't use words in straight lines, doesn't even use words coming out of folks' mouths like this one, but is perhaps more visual, more associative, less easily nailed down, broader, spiritual. Get that in the end. I think there's a case for that. Anyway, I hope the noise in the dryer hasn't been too distracting. Yeah, thanks very much. Bye.